We're really happy that we were fortunate enough to be introduced to Tory. She reached out to me, and I'm really glad that she did. For the last 35 years, Tory has been one of the volunteers running 16 peer-led support groups weekly at the Mood Disorder Support Group of New York, providing support to groups and individuals and also their families. She's been trained as a certified peer specialist and psychiatric rehabilitation practitioner.
Whatever that means.
Yeah. she'll fill you in on that, but it sounds good. And she's been trained to use her own personal experience to help others. 6 years ago, after moving to East End full-time, she was allowed to create her volunteer groups out of the Wellness Center at Southampton Hospital, or Stony Brook, sorry, Southampton Hospital. Can't get used to that. Tory's passionate about spreading the word that a meaningful recovery is available to anyone who's suffering, and we look forward to hearing more about her. Please welcome Tory Masters.
Whether you're here for yourself or for a loved one or because you're interested in mental health, I'm really glad you're all here. As Yvette just said, my name is Tory Masters, and wait for it, I have a diagnosis of major depression and anxiety, which started dogging me and nipping at my heels when I was 18. That was many, many, many decades ago. Why would I disclose that so willingly? One really important reason. I finally found a recovery path that worked for me. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Everybody? Okay, good. And after years of denial, not seeking help because of shame, not seeking answers because I believed that there was something simply fundamentally wrong with me. I had no idea that it was actually brain chemistry. The chemistry in that organ, the brain, was the problem. I didn't know that. In the process, I found out that a sustainable and really meaningful recovery is possible for all of us who struggle or have a loved one who does. And I'm here to share what I've learned because I waited so long to help myself and to stop feeling so much shame and hiding behind my diagnosis. And I could have been decades further along if I'd done this sooner. So I'm hoping that if even one person tonight or a loved one of yours can get this message that you won't have to wait much longer at all. And that's why I'm here. I'm here to share that having a mental health disorder does not mean you're crazy, because I used to think I was crazy, hence the title of the lecture, or that there is something fundamentally flawed with you. Nor is it your fault. I never knew that. I thought it was absolutely my fault. How else could it be? I brought on my own depression and anxiety and misery. It means, truthfully, that you have a treatable disease of the brain that, if left unaddressed, can cause long-term emotional distress and a life out of balance and a lack of real connection with other people in the long run. And that was one of the things that I learned along the journey, was how important connection to others is. That the only way to connect with somebody, truly connect, is being your authentic self. No secrets, no mask, your real self. And I didn't know that for decades. For those of you who might not know, 1 in 4 Americans suffer from a mental health disorder, and 4 or 5 Americans are loved ones of someone who suffers. So that's kind of all of us, don't you think? Mm-hmm. Who are we kidding? I used to think when I lived in the city and I was finally in recovery, and it would be rush hour and people on the streets, hundreds of people on the streets, and I said, I bet if you put a spotlight on each of those people, all but maybe 2 would not be dealing in some form with suffering. whether it's themselves or a loved one. So I'm here to tell you, by sharing my story, which you will hear in a few minutes, of a long, zigzagging journey to mental health. And it was long and zigzagging, because I had no idea what I was doing. That if you venture out of that self-imposed isolation that some of you might relate to, that you put yourselves in when we feel low, depressed, and anxious, and we're struggling with our self-esteem, what do? We isolate. If we're willing to venture out of that self-imposed isolation to find the right community supports, that's the first step. If you become knowledgeable about mental health disorders, and I will talk about that more later, because it's incredibly important, and if you find the right therapeutic, medical, and holistic strategies, you will be well on your own journey to a meaningful and sustainable recovery path of your own. You will learn tonight that you are not your disease. I used to think I was my disease, and that everything else swirled around it, but I was my disease. But no, I was a person with a treatable mental health disorder. It took me decades to get that. So the goal for all of us is to thrive within our communities, not just survive. Despite having to manage a mental health disorder, I still have to manage my mental health disorder every day. And I'm fine about doing that, because I got my life back and then some. So before I tell my story, and I think Yvette set me up really well here, so bear with. My recovery led me to make mental health my vocation, for the reasons I told you guys a few minutes ago. I wanted to help others and not suffer for as long as I did. So, as Yvette said, I'm a certified mental health peer specialist and a psychic rehabilitation practitioner. What that means is that I've been trained and certified to use my own lived experience of having had a mental health disorder and found recovery strategies to help others find theirs. That's my sole purpose for what I do. 8 years ago, I founded, and I'm not sure yet whether it's 6 or 8, I've lost track. I founded the peer-led East End Mood Disorder Support Group, otherwise known as EEMDSG, out of Stony Brook Southampton Hospital. We run 3 peer facilitated groups weekly, 2 for individuals who have a mental health disorder and 1 for families and loved ones. There's no fee, there's no RSVP. If you're interested, you just sign up and you show up if you feel like it. The reason why we have included, and I learned this years ago in my groups in New York, a group for family and loved ones is because the only way that loved ones can have an effective relationship with the person who is suffering is if they do 3 things. 1, they have to learn about how important their own self-care is. So if a family member is not taking care of themselves because they're obsessing about the loved one, there is no way that that family member will thrive. Not a chance. Quite the opposite. The second thing is to learn what healthy boundaries are. I'm sure that many of you in this room, think or believe or get frustrated with a loved one, and you feel like, I don't know how to create healthy boundaries with this person. We seem to always be like this at each other. I don't know what to do. I think I'm over-involved, or am I under-involved? And so finding healthy boundaries is critical to helping your loved one. And the third thing is that families and loved ones in our groups learn how to communicate effectively. We spend a lot of time, again, at each other because we don't know how to communicate effectively. And we're coming at the relationship from guilt or resentment and all kinds of things, and we're not communicating effectively. So that's why we have a family and friends group, and when the family gets involved in a really effective way, it makes a huge difference on the recovery outcome for the person who's suffering. I discovered, before I tell you my story, the power of peer support groups back in 1991, when I was at a complete loss as to how to help myself. And I'm now in my late 30s, early 40s. I don't remember, it seems like such a long time ago. I attended my first group, the Mood Disorder Support Group of New York, acronym MDSG. That decision not only saved, but transformed my life. And I really mean that. And I'll tell you more about that later. Once in recovery, I trained as a peer facilitator and then started running groups. Over the next 25 years, showing my age now, I helped MDSG grow from 1 weekly group to 16 every week for people with bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety disorders, family and loved ones, as well as affinity groups such as LGBTQ, BIPOC, and young adults. I am vice chair of MDSG's board of directors and am a facilitator trainer. And when my husband and I, Howie's in the back of the room, say hi. He's my secret weapon over there. He runs the family and friends group. And I'll get to you later, Amy. I have another facilitator here. And when we moved out here full time, we started. Okay, you ready for my story? Okay, I don't know if I am. No, I am. Okay, childhood, and I am sure there are people in this room who can relate to some of this. It was really traumatic. I never wanted to get off the bus because I never knew what I would find at home. And so I was terrified to get off the bus every day. That's starting, at the age of 5. I never knew what I would encounter. And the bottom line is there was emotional abuse, there was incest and violence. This is the truth of my story. I had a much older sister and brother who went untreated for both bipolar illness and borderline personality disorder. In those days, in the 60s and 70s, one didn't seek treatment or even knew treatment was available, and for the most part it wasn't. It wasn't. But it was before the days of even discovering lithium. So, unfortunately, my older siblings were out of control, and the household was in constant and terrifying chaos. I made it, and I'm sure some of you relate to this too, I made it my job to be the good girl. I pretended I was fine and not in need. I never expressed my feelings, never asked for help, never told anyone that I was scared. And because I thought if I could be the one solid rock in the family, even at the age of 5, maybe everything would be okay. So I helped everyone else. I tried to rescue all my family members, mom, dad, brothers, sisters, from the time I was 5 years old until I was in my 40s. Tragically, both my older siblings eventually ended their lives due to never getting the treatment and support they needed. If they had been born at a different time and in a different family, that would not have happened. Not have happened at all. And that, when they died, I realized, it was when I found out that I actually didn't have the power to save them. As one little person, I could not possibly save them. But that had never occurred to me. So I just kept rescuing. All those decades I was in rescue mode, so I could never relax. And when you're in that mode, and you're hyper vigilant all the time, it's unsustainable. So it was no wonder, actually, that my first major depressive and anxiety episode happened when I was 18. I couldn't sustain the hypervigilance and the rescuing. So imagine, because your body's on high alert all the time. I was terrified, but in a matter of a couple of months, the depression lifted. And I think I remember telling one friend on the beach that I was going through this, but I was really scared to tell that person. And then more episodes off and on again throughout my 20s and 30s and early 40s. And I noticed that each episode lasted longer and felt darker, and then they'd lift. But everyone felt more precarious than the one before. I managed to have a successful career in television. I was a senior producer at ABC News. I booked all the guests for Good Morning America. I finally was head of daytime programming for HBO. I had friends, married, and had a son who's now 34. But my mask was always on. I didn't realize that the reason I kept spiraling into depression and bouts of anxiety because my high alert and perfectionism mode was never turned off, ever. So I could never just relax and be me and cry or ask for help, get support from somebody. No, could not do that. So I had no emotional resilience at all, and I'm going to talk more about that later. I went through, during these decades, a revolving door of psychiatrists and therapists. I had no idea if I was in good hands or not, nor why I was really there and what I was being treated for. I just knew I was a hurting buckaroo, but I didn't know what I had to work on. I didn't know. I had no clue. So I just went from one therapist to another who didn't help me because I couldn't help myself. And I think they were pretty mediocre therapists because I didn't know what to look for in a good therapist in those days. Then the big one hit. And this was in 1991. This was the one that finally did me in. I could not get out of bed for months. I was literally unable to function, and it was I felt like I was in a black hole 24/7. I had to step down from a company that I had launched, but I was still in denial and ashamed about needing help. But I was sure my life was over. I just thought, if this keeps going on, there's no reason to stay on this planet. Not one. And I had a decision to make at that point. I had a lot I wanted to live for. I finally realized that if I wanted to live, I had to accept that I could not box my way out of this one. I had to surrender to getting help. So I'll never forget this as long as I live. I showed up to my first peer-led support group, which was MDSG in New York, Beth Israel Hospital, 3rd floor. And I didn't want to be there. It was to me, it was a admission that I was a really screwed up individual, and that I was going to encounter people that I could not possibly relate to. I get off the elevator, and there are literally maybe 80 or 90 people who were going up and down the hallways waiting for their groups to begin, because we had 16 groups going. I wasn't part of it yet. And I just thought, oh my God, I thought I was the only one. Then there was this really tall guy with a beard, Howard Smith, who became one of my closest buds, who was going up and down the aisle. He was a facilitator at that time, not an attendee, wearing a bozo nose and blowing through a kazoo, trying to call the groups to order. And I said, how bad could this possibly be? How bad could this be? Look at Howard, who incidentally suffered from bipolar illness. So I never left. I found my first belonging. I found my tribe. I found hope and belief in the recovery process. I found that I was absolutely not alone at all. And I found there, through my other peers in the groups, the inspiration and the motivation to advocate for myself. Because I hadn't advocated for myself at all in those decades. Not once, in terms of mental health. It was a place that I could finally come out of isolation and where there was no judgment, nothing but compassion and empathy and understanding. It was oh boy, I just remember this. It was a confidential place where I could be my complete self, warts and all. I could reveal my secrets. And the negative thinking that dogged me day in and day out, that I was flawed and worthless, that I somehow got away with being successful in television and having friends, and I somehow just thought I must have faked my way through that. I'm sure some of you in this audience are familiar with the negative self-talk, those voices in our heads that tell us that we're no good and we'll never get well. I learned, which we'll talk about later, that negative self-talk is a habit and it's fiction. It's what we tell ourselves without any evidence and without any perspective whatsoever. But more on that later. I finally realized we're all swimming in the same sea. We all have vulnerabilities. We all suffer in one way or another. We are all just human beings trying to do the best we can with what we know and what we have. That by opening up to our peers, we can finally let down the mask and show our true hearts and souls. And in return, and this makes me teary every time I think about this, and in return, witness others share theirs. I finally realized what real connection is and how critical connection with others is to our overall well-being and sense of self. So, I think about the mask I always had up. I somehow managed to have friends, but was I really connecting? I don't think so. No, because nobody knew the truth about me. So peer support gave me all of that. Plus, it's the place where we educate each other, talk about what recovery and coping strategies work, and then help each other take those first crucial steps onto the recovery path. And then cheerlead each other on with every next step we take. So, here's what I learned and how I finally got on the right recovery path. And this is what I wanted to really impart to all of you, because it took me so long to get it. So, I'm going to start with this. Negative self-talk and self-imposed isolation are actually worse than the diagnosis, the disease itself. What I mean by that, and I don't know if anybody in this room understands what I just said, but because I sure didn't for a really long time. When those voices in our heads that tell us that we aren't good enough, not strong enough, not capable enough, not pretty enough, not educated enough, that is negative self-talk that we have learned as a habit. And what I mean by that is when we are in isolation with these negative self-talks, because that's where it all starts, when we don't get proper feedback, objective feedback, compassionate feedback from others. all we have left in our isolation is the negative rat-a-tat-tat. And so, we think the worst of ourselves and judge ourselves. We are our own worst critics. And it's fiction. And I didn't learn that for a very long time. It was black and white thinking. So, as an example, you know, somebody that you know is walking down the street and you wave and they don't respond. And you think, she doesn't like me, I knew it. I'm so embarrassed that I even tried to reach out to her, and so on and so forth. What that person, that was negative self-talk that had no evidence attached to it. Perhaps this person walking down the street was not wearing her glasses and couldn't see her. Perhaps that other person was in their own world and their own depression and just couldn't even look up. But the negative talk was, obviously she doesn't like me. If we make a mistake at work, and we feel as though we're either a success or we are a failure, or some, you know, version therein. As opposed to, okay, I messed up, I learned something, I'm going to talk to my boss about how I can, if I can get a little bit more instruction in this area. But instead, that person goes home and says, I'm a failure. The other part of negative self-talk is how many of us in this room, you don't have to raise your hands, it's okay. Just think about it. Negative self-talk also means that we're either ruminating about the past and are in regret about the past, shoulda, woulda, coulda, and are always thinking about how I could have done something differently in the past. Or we are obsessing about the future and are in fear of the future and what it holds. I'll never get that next job. So if you can, any of you can relate to ruminating about the past and obsessing about the future and the what ifs, that is a habit that we are completely in control of breaking. And that's the part that took me a really long time in therapy to fully understand that it was a habit, like any other habit. When I first heard about negative self-talk, and I said, but it just happens, it's just in your brain, it's the talking, you know, it's just the talking that happens. No. We are in control of those voices, but we don't think we are until we learn that we actually are. So that is a major recipe. Isolation and negative self-talk is a major recipe for having a mental health disorder. Makes complete sense. I understand that now. Number two, I finally realized that stress and untreated trauma are reasons for developing a mental health disorder. I didn't know that for a long time. So an example of that is if you're on high alert all the time, like I was as a kid, and then all the way through until I was in my early 40s. So the switch is never off. You're never in a relaxed place. You're never actually living in the present. You're waiting for the next shoe to drop. So, and it's unsustainable. It's absolutely unsustainable to have that kind of, that level of stress with the switch always on. So, the fight or flight response, we've all heard of that. Animals in the wild, you see them on National Geographic Channel, and you know, the zebras are at the watering hole, and the The lion comes, and they all take off and scatter, and real and present danger. Not perceived danger, it was the real thing. So they scattered, they went off, and when they come back to the watering hole, they do this. If you look at National Geographic, I swear you will see this. They shake it off. It's called the somatic response. Their whole bodies shake it off so that they literally reset their entire systems. And then they're back to living in the present until the next lion shows up and they have to take action. Humans don't do that. We should all learn how to shake it off. Let's do it right now. So, wow, I was gobsmacked when I heard that. That makes sense. Wild animals have it all over us humans, I tell you. They don't live in trauma, those wild animals. So, second thing is, speaking of trauma, is untreated trauma. I was mentioning it a few minutes ago. If we grow up in trauma and with trauma, it is literally in our bones. And it's in our brains too. So we are always, if we haven't dealt with the trauma. So for me, for example, the violence, incest, and so on and so forth. If you stuff that, and it's in your body, and you have stuffed it down, and you're kind of walking through life like a stoic, like this, it's still in there, and it's going to find a way to come out. The problem is, it's going to come out as depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, you name it, because we haven't dealt with it. We haven't unloaded it. We haven't had a therapist or a support group sit with us through it so that we can finally start to let it go. And by the way, I'm going to try to, I want to make sure there's time for questions toward the end, so I'm going to try to keep a clock on this. So, okay. So I told you about negative self-talk. I've told you about stress, fight or flight, and untreated trauma. The next thing that I realized that I had to do was I had to get educated. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I had no idea that I actually had a mental health disorder. All I knew was that I would crash and burn every little while. So I remember during that time when I couldn't get out of bed for so long in 1991, what I did do, because Howie made me, I crawled across the street on Broadway to a bookstore and sat on the floor. And I started pulling books off the shelf about mental health. And oh my God, that was one of the first things that changed everything, because all of a sudden I was going, oh my gosh, that's me. That's me, that's me, that's not me. Oh my God, there's a name for this. Ooh, I think I suffer from that. So it gave me such a clear picture of what I was ailing from. And so I began to be able to ask questions and then know what I had to do next to help myself. So without getting educated, you don't stand a chance. Because without getting educated, then you cannot have a real partnership with a therapist or a psychiatrist. And you deserve to get educated about what's going on with you. It changes everything. And it changed everything for me. And it was very empowering too, because I was able to say to a psychiatrist, you know, here are 3 chapters of this book. This is exactly me, because I didn't have words for it yet. And I felt so empowered that I could really partner with a psychiatrist, because I had a real sense of what was going on with me, as opposed to just having a psychiatrist say, yeah, okay, so take these 2 pills, every day, and then we'll see you in a month. And I dutifully do it. Mm-mm. Mm-mm. That is not how to partner with a psychiatrist. I also found out, by getting educated, that there's a very big difference between a mediocre therapist and psychiatrist and the truly gifted ones who specialize. Finding the right professionals makes all the difference between managing to survive and actually thriving. How many of us survive day to day, but we know we're not thriving? But we think surviving is going to be as good as it gets. Mm-mm. That's true unless you get educated, really figure out what kind of a therapist and psychiatrist you might need. So if for therapists, for example, what do they specialize in? Trauma, substance abuse, PTSD, personality disorders, dual diagnosis, which includes mental health and substance abuse. And not just what is their specialty, but what's their schooling? Where are they trained? Who have they been supervised by? What institutes have they been affiliated with? You want to know all that, because that's where the gifted ones are, because they really want to be excellent at what they do. They want to be the best. There are many different types of therapy. You guys have probably heard of dialectical behavioral therapy. You throw out that term every little while. Cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-informed therapy, addiction therapy. There's so many. Well, which one is the right one for us? For me, cognitive behavioral therapy really worked because I had to work on my negative self-talk and perceptions of myself, as well as the wrong choices I was making for myself. So I figured out, okay, so that's what I need, somebody like that. And it may sound daunting to find them, but with research, it will all become clear to you. You could even do something as simple as to go on, I think it's psychologytoday.com, and they have lists of therapists and so on. If you just look, you'll see which ones and what they do, what their credentials are, what their specialties are, and what makes them a really good fit for you or not. Just that little exercise will give you a hint. The right psychiatrist, where do you find them? What about their specialty, their deep education, research, clinical trials? Are they experts in bipolar, depression, anxiety, schizoaffective disorders, or all of it? I finally found, I went through a revolving door of psychiatrists because I didn't know what to look for. And then I finally found, and it made sense to me, the psychiatrist, I found a psychiatrist at Columbia, associate professor, head of the New York State Psychiatric Institute, does clinical trials, writes books, papers, and is sort of on the forefront of the field. So it stands to reason that they would have a deep education and specialty, and it's worth seeking them out if you have had, if you've been in a hard to treat situation, if you found yourself not getting well, and not well enough, and the depression is always dogging you, get a second opinion. And even, most psychiatrists would even tell you to get a second opinion if they're not able to get you the rest of the way, and would welcome a second opinion. Then, hold on, how are we doing? Okay. Then, and this is not easy, guys, then you have to, once you find the right therapist, and by the way, my psychiatrist did get me on the right medication. I forgot to tell that part. And I just remember sitting in my apartment on Broadway, looking out the window, and for the first time in like a year, I saw the world in color again. And I could feel my son again, really feel him. And I loved that first sip of coffee. It was delicious. And it was like a curtain had gone up. I remember it to this day. Because I knew then I was going to be okay. But, there's always a but. I still had to do the therapy because I lacked emotional resilience. What hadn't changed, despite the fact that I was on very good medication and was feeling fine, I was still, hypervigilant. I was still wearing a mask. I still felt like I had to be a perfectionist. None of that had gone away. So I still couldn't show vulnerability, being human, because I wasn't allowed in my family. And of course, the groups in 1991 started me in that direction, of course. But I had to work on all that. I had to get over thinking danger was around every corner. I had to deal with my lack of self-esteem. Being told as a child that, you're never good enough. And why did I always find myself in unhealthy relationships? So I realized I had a lot of work to do in therapy, and I can't say it was fun. It was not fun. It was really hard work. But it's the most important mission I've ever been on for myself. It's worth the work because some might argue differently, but I think now I'm a fully formed human being. Not everyone might agree. You, Tory, are you kidding me? You got a long way to go, girl. So the work is worth it, and so it's not an either or. It's not meds and I'm fine. We have to do the work to find out, what it is that keeps tripping us up. Why do we keep making those decisions that don't serve us? So, and I just remember I used to go to my therapist, and I would, every time I had a new boyfriend, I would tell her I was cured and leave. I'd say, I'm good. All's good now. Until she finally showed me the door and said, you're not ready. And I went, what? I'm not ready? And I got to a place where I went back to her and I said, do not let me out of here until you say I'm ready. And that was a good 20 years more. And it was the best. She was a guide, a mentor. We should all have them. We should all have them. So that's kind of the end of my talk. I just want to add one thing and then open it up to questions, is that the power of peers, there is nothing like it. So the peer support groups, I found, are the things that keep us staying in the game and being willing to take one step after another after another. And I'm looking at somebody here in the audience, Amy, who was an attendee. Amy Rule, just put up your hand, who started with me in the groups however many years ago that was, and you did not think that you would ever see your way through depression and being stuck, and she is one of my great facilitators. Yeah, a very gifted facilitator that I trained. And
how could I not be with you?
I paid her to say that. No. Anyway, thank you, Amy. So there is no substitute for peer support, because it's the thing that gets us launched and out of isolation, and we link arms together to figure this nasty thing out. And we help each other take one tiny little step. I remember, I'll just tell this story out of turn, but when Amy couldn't even get out of her chair on a day-to-day basis, and I relate to that so well because I couldn't get out of bed at my apartment on Broadway. And so we said, well, because Amy used to like to hike, and that hadn't happened in a really long time. And we said, well, what if, could you walk around your dining room table? And Amy said, I could do that. And so we said, okay, so try that and let us know how it goes. That was the beginning. And now Amy is hiking and hiking and hiking. She keeps calling me and asking me to go hiking with her. I say, please leave me alone. Go away. And so that's the point. That's how incremental the steps are, guys. You can't go from A to Z before getting to B and then C. So walking around the dining room table was huge, and it led to so much more. So, just so you know, peers, I'm going to toot my own horn. We are hired in mental health clinics, hospitals, and VA centers because peer specialists, we, just in New York State alone, when you add a peer into the mix with a therapist, a psychiatrist, social worker, and so on, and the other supports, in New York State, we reduce rehospitalizations by 62%. That's correct. And that's just the start of it. So when I worked at Hands Across Long Island, one of the largest peer-run mental health clinics in the country, in Islip a number of years ago for 5 years, and Medicaid paid my salary because we are an evidence-based practice. It's been proven that we save them gajillions of dollars in rehospitalizations and emergency room visits and everything else. We help each other stay in our communities and not feel like, I've got to go to the hospital. I'm not feeling good, because that has been your default position. So, no, you don't got to go to the hospital most of the time. Of course, when there's crisis, of course. But we don't realize that we actually can do this with the help of others. We can do this. We can stay in our communities. So, that's my talk. Who has questions? No, come on. Oh, yes. Good.
Tory,
Yeah.
if someone doesn't feel well
Yeah.
and they know they would like to speak with a psychiatrist, but they haven't had a diagnosis, if someone says, gee, you know, something's off with me, I need to talk to someone, but they don't know whether, you know, what specific disorder they have, and they follow your advice and they try to seek out the most highly educated, specialized psychiatrist that they can. In that first step, is there, since they don't know what their diagnosis
Yeah.
is there a general practitioner level of psychiatrist, super general practitioner that could evaluate you and say, I think you have this, and my associate doctor so-and-so is better,
It's a,
able to handle that?
it's a good question. If I understand you correctly, could the right primary care physician be able to help one out?
Well,
Is that what you meant?
a general psychiatrist.
Oh, a general psychiatrist.
Yeah, if I don't know what my specific mental disorder illness might be, how do I get that diagnosis?
Okay.
I know I don't feel well, but how do I get a specific
So, yes, I mean,
diagnosis?
that could be a general psychiatrist. And the idea, and this is what I did, was because I didn't know if this was medical, purely medical for me, or whether this was my circumstances and this was my fault. And I brought this on. So I first went to a psychiatrist to be evaluated for whether I did or didn't have a medical diagnosis. So a good psychiatrist is also capable of saying, you don't need me, you need therapy. So it's really important to be able to suss that out so you can rule it out or in. And then you can take the next step, which is to figure out what kind of therapy you could really use to be able to build emotional resilience and self-esteem and self-acceptance. Have I answered your question? Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
Back in '91, when you were
Yeah,
struggling
my
to
favorite
get out of
year.
your room, was there anything in particular that triggered your beginning to get out of your room?
Yes, it was that or in my life. I was that sick, and I knew that I couldn't sustain this. I was so sick that I couldn't function. I couldn't leave my bed. I mentioned earlier I couldn't even feel my young son. I couldn't read. I couldn't sleep. So I was in really big trouble. And so I realized, what am I going to do with this? I've had times in my life when I felt really good. I want to find that again. So that was when I finally said, I can't box my way out of this one. So I have to get support if I'm going to live and move on and truly get well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Yes.
you mentioned you found inspiration, so I guess that goes along with, like you said, how was it that you got out of that? You said you found inspiration
I did.
and advocate for yourself. Did you ever at any time like have a friend or somebody who would try to talk to you and then it wouldn't work and then you try to find
No,
somebody
because
else?
I wouldn't admit it to anyone. I wouldn't admit it to my closest friends. Can you believe it?
No, yeah.
And I had great friends. No. So that's how ashamed I was. And I felt that my friends should want to see me a certain way. I've always presented a certain way, and if I stop presenting that way, they may not want to be my friend anymore. So the inspiration came from the support group that I crawled to, and then found compassion, understanding, people just like me, and that's when the walls came down. So the inspiration to want to fight for myself came from those groups, without question. It's funny. I mean, I'll never forget one of my closest friends had known me. She was in my wedding. I was in her wedding. And when I had no choice but to tell her the truth, because I was non-functional. And I'll never forget having dinner with her, and she said, Tory, you don't understand. You are a much more interesting person to me now, because you're human, and you're showing that you're the normal vulnerabilities that the rest of us have. You don't understand. Thank you for sharing this with me. It makes me cry every time I think of it. And I'm like, really? You don't want the TV star and the perfectionist? No, she did not. She did not. Yes?
What did you do during the pandemic? How was that? It seems like every year was like isolating then, and there was like, you couldn't leave your house, things like that.
Well, the pandemic, I was I was no longer, I was fine. So in other words, I was already well and had been for a long time. So I was 20 years into being well by the time the pandemic hit.
Did it seem like more people needed help?
Oh, great question. They sure did. And I'm glad you brought that up because I meant to mention that before. You know, the statistic of 1 in 4 Americans suffering, that's an old statistic from, I think, the early, before COVID. I'm sure it's much more now because that's all that we talked about is mental health. And it's on the airwaves, and it's in the news, and it's in every article, and it's in every school. And so I have a feeling that 1 in 4 has changed a lot. And so if ever there was a time to normalize this conversation, it's now. It's now.
Tory, when you, so do you ever have dips?
That's a great question. No, because I'm a perfectionist. I have dips, but they're so manageable. So they're circumstantial dips. And because I have emotional resilience now, I can recognize that it's a circumstantial dip. And because I'm no longer on high alert, I'm not destined to crash and burn. I've got that part down. So now, if I'll have a dip, but it's completely normal. It's manageable and it doesn't last. And I used to be really afraid of having a dip. If I got a dip, I would be terrified. Oh my God, should I call my psychiatrist? Here I go again. And, I've learned to say, calm down, deep breaths, and just let go. And, and for me to be able to let go after decades of never letting go is an accomplishment. I can just be in it and know that it will pass. And Howie reminds me that it will pass. Seriously, because I can go to Howie and I go, I don't know, I'm feeling a little weak. And he'll just go, sit down, have a cup of tea, you're okay. Been here before a million times. So he's a big help. Thank you, honey. Because he's put up with a lot. Oh my God. Hi, Carol.
This is not a question. I just want to thank you and Hallie for changing so many lives out here. You are an inspiration to all of us. You've changed our son's life. You just have, we couldn't be in a good place without you guys. So it's beautiful.
There is no other place we'd rather be. So, I got excited when Amy went 3 times around the dining room table. I was ecstatic for a couple of days over just that. So, yeah. Thank you very much. Yes.
Hi. I don't know how to begin this, but my concern is that we have a son that's bipolar and narcissistic, and you know.
I'm sorry, narcissistic, you said?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I want to know when that period that you were so isolated and so bad, where you weren't getting out of bed,
Yeah.
you weren't eating properly.
No, not at all.
Right. I want to know what helped you, or how was Howie with you to help you get out of, push you out of there?
That's a really good
Because
question.
we're having difficulty with that, with our son. We don't know if we're helping him or harming him. And he is very stuck.
And how old is he?
He's 55.
Right.
Hasn't worked in 6 years. Hasn't, very intelligent, professional man. And he's doing nothing with himself. He has nobody anymore. His family gave up on him.
I do.
His children don't see him or talk with him. His wife made him get out of the house, so he's living with us. So I want to know what became out of that to get you to just say, enough is enough. I gotta help myself. And how did Howie help you to get there?
Well, in my case, you know, I had been, you know, as I said, when it hit, I had just launched my own company. I was doing really well in a whole different field. I had 12 employees. You know, I was in theory, should have been fine. And, but I realized that launching this company took everything out of me. And then that whole hypervigilance thing took over again. So that's when I crashed and burned this time with the big one. So Howie, number one, never babied me. He never coddled me. He was kind and supportive and very understanding and listening, even though he had never dealt with anything like this in his life. And I was amazed by his courage and his ability to stay really calm and with me without judgment. That kind of blew my mind right then. How he got that out. But then he would say little things like, "Now get yourself downstairs to the gym." So it was little tiny things like that, but the truth of the matter is, he would not have stood for it if I refused to help myself. If I had continued on refusing to help myself, I don't know what would have happened to our marriage. I was, you know, when I went to that first support group, and I started to, you know, get educated, study, and find therapists and psychiatrists, Howie knew I was on this 150%, and I wasn't going to quit until I got well. I don't think he would have, our marriage would have lasted if I just decided to blow bubbles in bed and be in denial and think it was okay to not pay my own way and not, parent my child. No. So I had to grow myself up. Our marriage would never have survived if I hadn't seized the moment and went for it. So sadly, when you have an adult son who is that age, this is the choice he's making and choosing to make, and you can't do anything to change that. Absolutely nothing. It's not in your power. The only thing, and this is a much longer conversation, by the way, the only thing you can do as a family is to insist that he takes responsibility for his stuff, otherwise he can't live there. There's so many things. Insisting that here are the rules in this house. You have to.
The alternative is you make them homeless, and I can't do that.
It's a long road, and it's a long story, and it's not for here, because it's complicated. But, this is what Howie's groups are all about. And I think that, because we could sit and have a 2-hour conversation about this, and I really understand the dilemma that all families face. I really do. It's an awful position to be in with a child. And, but it's there are books written on this. Like, I'm not sick, I don't need help. the classic one. And it's a blueprint for what do you do when that is the case, even though it might break your heart. But it's, without giving them responsibility for themselves, they can't grow themselves up. And so keeping them home without rules is keeping them childlike. So that's the conundrum, because I totally understand your, as a parent, how can I let him be out on the street?
Like I
So-
said, he couldn't sleep nights, he was out in the woods.
I understand. And the fascinating thing is that may be the one thing that saves him.
Thank you.
Because he will finally say, oh, okay, so if there's no free ride anymore, I better get my act together. Because how is he living well now? So
You
this,
bid for about 16 hours.
I would say get as much help around this as you possibly can, because this is a really tough situation to come to terms with. But look, I'm not sick, I don't need help, is a blueprint that is, for any family, it's brilliant. Okay, and it's just so, all the experts have, will tell you the same thing. And at the end of the day, we have to make our own decisions, don't we? We're going over, and I want to make sure you guys are okay with that. So we should end, I think, in a few minutes, right? I mean, Yvette said we could stay another couple of minutes.
Sure.
Anyway, I hope that I've helped and not made you feel worse.
No, you helped a great deal, thank you.
Okay?
You know how doctors used to do that, sorry about that.
I know, it's okay, Jim.
Households.
Say that again?
How doctors used to do households.
House calls, yes.
Is there any psychiatrists that would do households?
All you know, any psychiatrists would do a house call.
Although there's an organization from the Comic Center that has doctors to the ACT team that will come out to your house. And they'll see the patient, they'll medicate them. First, there's the other one, which is the crisis intervention team that will come and make the evaluation. But there are people who do come routinely, but the patient has to have someone be brought in. They usually provide a psychotherapist and medication.
And so to Paul's point, the individual has to want it. So if that your grown son does not want it, it's not going to happen. That's the problem.
But it is right now. I don't, it's not about him anymore, it's about us. How we have to educate ourselves. We have to see a real good therapist.
Yay! That's exactly right.
Because,
Congratulations for that thought.
yes, it's a must, because the show can't keep going on.
Exactly. And if you can't do it yourselves, yes, get yourself a wonderful facilitator who's an expert in this area who can really guide you and get you all on the same page. So that, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question.
Any experience with either ECT or TMS and how?
I have not had it myself, but I know others who have, and for some it has worked. ECT is not the same thing as it was many decades ago. And it is still considered a last resort for understandable reasons, but it can be very effective, and I've seen people in my groups do really well with that. And TMS,
I'm not sure that's the right.
transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Okay.
I know of a few people who have done it, and one in particular who did very well, but I don't know who's a candidate for that. Each person would have to be evaluated, and the psychiatrist would have to say, well, you know what, we tried this and this and this and this. Why don't we try this now? Because we seem to have tried everything else. So it's a choice depending on how much you are still not being very articulate right now. if you're not well enough yet and you're stuck, then those kinds of things are really hard. And there's a lot more in the pipeline, by the way, coming up in terms of medications and treatments that are very exciting, but they're not approved yet. One of them is LSD. Yeah, baby. And it will be approved within the next 5 years. Yeah, because my psychiatrist is in the forefront of that, in Columbia, and they're all working on it, at Mayo Clinic and Johns Hopkins and McLean, they're all working on it, and they're a few years away.